The morning sun cast long shadows across Edwards Air Force Base as crowds gathered for the most anticipated military aviation event of the decade, the public unveiling of the B-21 Raider stealth bomber. Media trucks lined the entrance, distinguished. Guests in tailored suits chatted excitedly, and uniformed personnel moved with purpose, preparing for a day that would mark American air superiority for generations to come. Among the chaos of arrivals, a modest sedan pulled into the visitor parking lot. George Thompson, 86, sat behind the wheel for a moment, gathering himself. His weathered hands, spotted with age but still steady, reached for a leather case on the passenger seat before carefully exiting the vehicle. George moved deliberately, each step measured, not from frailty, but from the careful precision that had defined his life. He wore a faded flight jacket that had seen better days decades ago, patches dulled by time, but still attached with military neatness. His cap bore no clear designation, just the patina of years of handling. Nothing about him screamed importance, just another elderly veteran coming to witness advancement in the field he once served. The morning air carried a hint of jet fuel and anticipation. George breathed it in, memories stirring with each inhalation. 58 years ago, he had stood on this very tarmac as a young Air Force engineer and test pilot, working on projects so classified that even his wife believed he worked on commercial aircraft designs. Now he had returned, drawn by an announcement in an aviation magazine that the next generation of the technology he helped pioneer would finally be revealed to the public. He approached the main entrance where a temporary security checkpoint had been established. Men and women in crisp uniforms checked credentials against digital databases, scanning ID cards and matching faces to security clearances. George joined the VIP line, standing out among the executives and officials in their pressed suits and polished shoes. At the checkpoint, a young security officer glanced up from his tablet with barely concealed impatience. "Name, sir?" "George Thompson. I should be on your list." George's voice carried the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being recognized in certain circles. The officer scrolled through his tablet once, twice, then a third time, with visible annoyance. "Sir, I don't see your name anywhere. This is an invitation-only event." "There must be some mistake," George said, maintaining his composure. "I worked on the original program, perhaps under classified personnel." The officer sighed. "Sir, we have all clearances updated for today's event. If you're not listed, you're not approved for entry." George reached into his inner pocket and produced an aged identification card, its edges worn soft from decades in his wallet. "This was my clearance for Project Midnight Ghost. It might be under that designation." The young officer barely glanced at the outdated ID. "Sir, this expired in 1982. I can't accept this as valid identification for today's event." A senior official, in an Air Force uniform, approached, noting the delay. "Is there a problem here?" The young officer explained the situation while George waited patiently. When addressed, George spoke quietly. "Colonel, I was part of the Midnight Ghost initiative in '67. That work directly preceded what you're unveiling today." The official's expression softened into something between sympathy and skepticism. "Many veterans claim connections to classified programs, sir. Without proper clearance or invitation, I can't help you. Perhaps you'd like to watch the flyover from the public viewing area outside the base." As George was politely but firmly escorted toward the exit, two younger men in expensive suits watched the exchange. One nudged the other. "These old-timers show up to everything," he said, voice carrying just enough for George to hear. "Probably just read about the program in Aviation Weekly and thinks he was involved." The other chuckled. "Fanboy with a fake ID." George heard them but kept walking, his face betraying nothing. Dignity, after all, had been his companion through darker moments than this. Outside the security perimeter, George paused to consider his options. To the east, a designated public viewing area had been set up, already filling with aviation enthusiasts, wielding telephoto lenses and binoculars, but instead of joining them, he followed the fence line westward, away from the crowds, until he found a quieter vantage point where the tarmac was clearly visible. He found a spot along the perimeter fence, away from the gathered public crowd but with a clear view of the tarmac. Standing alone, he opened his leather case, revealing a small pair of binoculars and a folder of technical drawings yellowed with age. For a moment, his stoic expression slipped, revealing a profound sadness in his eyes, the look of a man watching his life's work celebrated without him. The drawings were his original calculations for radar cross-section reduction, diagrams showing how to angle surfaces to scatter radar waves rather than reflect them back to their source. These principles, refined over decades, had eventually led to what the world would see today. He had carried these papers with him for almost 60 years, unable to share them with anyone outside a select group of engineers with the highest security clearances. Inside the restricted area, the ceremony was beginning with all the pomp militaria tradition demanded. High-ranking officers and aerospace executives took turns at the podium, each speech more grandiose than the last, celebrating American ingenuity and the future of aerial warfare. Though George couldn't hear their words from his position, he could read the mood of the event through his binoculars. Today marks the culmination of decades of research, innovation, and American determination, announced the Air Force Chief of Staff, his voice carried to the invited guests through a sophisticated sound system. The B-21 Raider represents not just a technological leap forward, but our commitment to maintaining air superiority for generations to come. Giant screens displayed sanitized historical footage of stealth development, carefully edited to reveal nothing still classified, skipping entire decades of the most crucial work, the very years when George had been most active. Brief mentions were made of the F-117 Nighthawk and B-2 Spirit, but nothing of the experimental aircraft that had crashed, killing 3 of George's closest colleagues during the early development phases. From his position by the fence, George followed along, occasionally nodding or shaking his head at certain technical claims. When one speaker referred to revolutionary radar cross-section reduction techniques developed in the early 2000s, George couldn't help but smile grimly. Those same techniques had been theorized in his notebooks from 1968, proven in wind tunnel tests by 1972 and implemented on experimental aircraft by 1978. A young family approached along the fence line, a father with 2 children who looked about 10 and 12. They set up a picnic blanket and a small spotting scope, excitement evident in the children's animated conversation. "Dad, will it really be invisible to radar?" the older child asked. "Not completely invisible," the father explained, "but it has what they call a very small radar cross-section. It's like trying to spot a bird instead of an airplane." George smiled to himself. The analogy wasn't bad, though vastly simplified. The younger child noticed George standing nearby. "Sir, are you a pilot?" she asked, pointing to his jacket. Before George could answer, the father intervened. "Honey, don't bother the gentleman." Then to George apologetically, "Sorry, sir, they're very excited about today." "No bother at all," George replied warmly. "And yes, I used to fly, a long time ago." "What did you fly?" the older child asked, earning another gentle admonishment from their father. George considered his answer carefully, mindful of classification, restrictions that, despite the passage of decades, still technically bound him. Test aircraft mostly, experimental things. It wasn't a lie, just a severe understatement. As the ceremony progressed, George's sense of isolation deepened. Inside the event, a sleek corporate video showed computer-generated imagery of the B-21's expected capabilities, its ability to penetrate the most sophisticated air defense systems and deliver precision strikes anywhere in the world. The audience of military officials, defense contractors, and selected media representatives watched with rapt attention, unaware that the principles enabling these capabilities had been developed by a man now standing alone outside the fence. George checked his watch, an old Omega Speedmaster that had accompanied him on countless test flights. The big reveal was scheduled for noon, still 45 minutes away. He sighed and shifted his weight, the old injury in his right knee flaring up as it always did when he stood too long. The pain was a souvenir from a night landing on an unmarked airstrip in Nevada, testing an early prototype with radar-absorbing materials that had partially failed during the flight. A commotion near the main viewing area drew his attention. A convoy of black SUVs had arrived, and from them emerged several high-ranking military officials and what appeared to be civilian dignitaries, perhaps members of Congress or defense industry executives. "Must be the VVIPs," the father beside him remarked. "I heard the Secretary of Defense might be attending." George nodded, recognizing some faces through his binoculars. The world of military aviation had changed dramatically, but the ceremonial aspects remained constant. The brass always showed up for the photo opportunities. His mind drifted back to 1967, to the first time he'd seen the conceptual drawings for what would eventually become stealth technology. He had been a young captain then, recruited from MIT, where he'd earned dual doctorates in aeronautical engineering and mathematics. The Cold War was at its height, and the Soviet Union had deployed increasingly sophisticated radar systems capable of detecting American reconnaissance aircraft. George had been part of a small team tasked with creating an aircraft that could evade these systems. The challenge had consumed the next 20 years of his life. Now, watching as officials gathered to celebrate the latest iteration of that technology, he felt both pride and a profound sense of disconnection, like watching strangers celebrate in a house he had built but could no longer enter. Inside the restricted area, Dr. Melissa Chen was only half listening to the ongoing speeches. As lead engineer on the B-21's radar-absorbing materials team, she had heard these talking points rehearsed countless times over the past weeks. Her attention was divided between keeping an eye on her 10-year-old son Alex, who had been allowed to attend as a special treat, and reviewing notes for the technical briefing she would deliver to a select group following the main ceremony. Alex, bored with the speeches, had been watching the perimeter of the event, noticing the old man with binoculars who seemed to be following the presentation with unusual intensity. Unlike the other spotters gathered at the public viewing area, this man stood alone and appeared to be reacting to specific technical points being made, nodding or frowning at exactly the moments when Dr. Chen herself would have done the same. "Mom," Alex whispered, tugging at her sleeve. "That old man by the fence knows something." "What man, honey?" Dr. Chen asked, distracted by a message coming through on her secure phone. "The one with the flight jacket. He keeps nodding and shaking his head when they talk about the stealth stuff, like he knows they're wrong about something." Dr. Chen glanced up, intrigued, despite herself. Her son had an uncanny ability to read people, a trait she'd come to respect despite his young age. She followed his gaze to where George stood, watching as the man reacted with a subtle headshake to a claim being made about radar-absorbing material innovation. Her phone buzzed again with an urgent message from her department. She needed to return a call before the main reveal, which meant stepping away from the VIP seating area momentarily. "Stay with Dr. Patterson," she instructed Alex, indicating her colleague seated beside them. "I need to make a call, back in 5 minutes." After completing her call in a designated secure area, Dr. Chen made her way back toward the VIP section. Her path took her near the perimeter fence, and curiosity led her to approach the spot where George stood with his binoculars and case. "Excuse me, sir," she said politely. "My son noticed you watching the presentation. Are you former Air Force?" George lowered his binoculars, surprised by the direct approach. He studied the woman before him, early 40s, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority, wearing a visitor badge with security clearance markings that indicated significant access. "Yes, ma'am, a long time ago." Dr. Chen noticed Alex had followed her despite her instructions to stay put. "Alex, I told you to wait with Dr. Patterson." "But Mom, look at his jacket. It has cool patches," Alex said, pointing to the faded insignia on George's flight jacket. George smiled at the boy's directness. "These are pretty old now. Most people don't recognize them anymore." "What's this one?" Alex asked, pointing to a particular patch partially hidden by the jacket's fold. "That's from a unit that doesn't officially exist," George answered with a wink. "Or at least it didn't back then." Dr. Chen studied the patch with growing interest, recognizing symbology consistent with highly classified test programs. "You worked at Groom Lake?" she stated rather than asked, referring to the facility commonly known as Area 51. George's expression revealed nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. "You seem to know quite a bit about what they're discussing," Dr. Chen pressed gently. "Just an old man with opinions, Mom," George deflected. "No," she said thoughtfully. "It's more than that." "You were reacting to Dr. Harrison's comments about the radar absorption materials. Those details weren't even in the public presentation. They're only audible in the VIP area." George tapped his ear with a smile. "Hearing aid, military grade. Picks up more than you might expect." Alex pointed at George's case. "What's in there?" "Are those airplane drawings?" George hesitated, then made a decision. He opened the folder slightly, revealing hand-drawn schematics with mathematical notations in the margins. "Just some old work of mine." Dr. Chen's eyes widened as she caught glimpses of the designs. "Those equations? They look remarkably similar to our current." She stopped herself, conscious of speaking in an unsecured area. George nodded knowingly and showed the boy a small, unmarked medal hidden inside his jacket. "This was for something I can't talk about even now. Some secrets stay secret for a very long time." Dr. Chen noticed the designation code etched on the back of the medal, a specific series she recognized from historical documents she had accessed during her doctoral research. Her expression changed from curiosity to genuine astonishment. "You're George Thompson," she said quietly. "The George Thompson?" Before he could respond, a security officer approached. "Ma'am, we need you back at the VIP area. The presentation is about to enter the classified briefing section." Then, noticing George, his demeanor shifted. "Sir, we need you to step back from the fence. This is a secure area." Dr. Chen attempted to intervene. "He's not causing any trouble. We were just..." "Ma'am, we have protocols in place for a reason. I need you to return to the designated area immediately." She reluctantly complied, but kept looking back at George as she led her son away. Once out of earshot of the security personnel, she pulled out her phone and made another call, speaking urgently in hushed tones while watching George stand alone by the fence. "This is Dr. Chen. I need to speak to General Morrison immediately." "Priority code Alpha 3. Yes, I understand he's about to go on stage. This can't wait. It's about George Thompson. Yes, that George Thompson. He's here, outside the perimeter fence. No, he hasn't been admitted. I've verified his identity, sir. He should be on that stage, not outside the fence." Dr. Chen hurried back to the VIP section where Alex was waiting with Dr. Patterson. The ceremony was approaching its climax with the Air Force Chief of Staff preparing to take the stage for the final remarks before the unveiling. "Melissa," Dr. Patterson asked, noting her urgent expression, "everything all right? Do you remember those declassified papers from the early stealth programs? The ones with the redacted author?" Dr. Chen whispered. Dr. Patterson nodded. "The Thompson equations, you mean? The foundation work that everything else built upon? What about them?" "I think Thompson is standing outside our fence right now," she replied, nodding toward George's distant figure. Dr. Patterson looked skeptical. "Melissa, George Thompson is practically a myth in our field. Half the engineers think he was a pseudonym for a committee. The other half think he died decades ago. Well, myth or not, I think I just saw his original calculations from 1967, and they're nearly identical to what we're still using." She nodded toward the presentation screen where the very principles George had developed were being described. Dr. Patterson's expression shifted from skepticism to concern. "If you're right, why the hell is he outside the fence?" "Because bureaucracy outlives innovation," Dr. Chen replied grimly, standing up. "Excuse me, I need to speak with General Morrison." As Dr. Chen made her way through the rows of seats toward the cordoned-off area where senior military officials were seated, the presentation continued. The engineer on stage had moved on to discussing the aircraft's operational capabilities, describing how its stealth properties would allow it to penetrate sophisticated integrated air defense systems. Outside the fence, George continued his solitary vigil, watching through his binoculars as the ceremony approached its climax. The technical presentations held his attention completely, so much so that he didn't notice when a pair of Air Force Security Forces personnel began moving along the perimeter toward his position. "Sir," the first officer called out as they approached, "this area is restricted during the ceremony. We need you to move back to the designated public viewing section." George lowered his binoculars and regarded the young officers respectfully. "Of course, I apologize for any concern." He began packing away his binoculars and folder, moving with the deliberate care of advanced age. "What's in the case, sir?" the second officer asked, his tone professional but firm. "Just some old papers and memories," George replied honestly. "Nothing of interest to anyone but an old engineer." The first officer softened slightly, noticing George's military bearing and flight jacket. "Were you Air Force, sir?" "A long time ago," George confirmed with a smile. "Before either of you were born, I'd wager." The officers exchanged glances, their training conflicting with their instinct to respect a veteran. The first officer made a decision. "Sir, we still need you to move to the public area, but there's no rush. Take your time gathering your things." George nodded gratefully. "Much appreciated. These old knees don't move as quickly as they once did." As George carefully closed his leather case, the officer noticed the edge of a document protruding from the folder, a blueprint with complex mathematical annotations. "You were an engineer?" he asked curiously. "Among other things," George acknowledged, securing the latch on his case. "Mostly I worked on problems no one else wanted to solve." Inside the venue, Dr. Chen had reached General Morrison, a silver-haired officer with 4 stars on his shoulders. He was listening to her with increasing interest, occasionally glancing toward the fence where George stood. "You believe that's actually George Thompson?" the general asked, his voice betraying surprise. "The George Thompson?" "I'm almost certain of it, sir," Dr. Chen replied. "I saw his original calculations. The handwriting matches the few declassified documents we have, and the mathematics is unmistakable. It's him." General Morrison frowned deeply. "This is unacceptable. Thompson's work is foundational to everything we're celebrating today. If he's here, he should be on this stage, not outside the fence." He turned to his aide. "Find out why Dr. Thompson isn't on our VIP list, and I want him brought in immediately." The aide hesitated. "Sir, security protocols require that all attendees be on the pre-approved." "Son, I'm giving you a direct order," General Morrison interrupted firmly. "George Thompson has higher natural clearance on this program than anyone here, including me. Find him and escort him in with full honors." As the aide hurried away to comply, Dr. Chen added, "Sir, security was already moving him away from the fence when I left. They may be escorting him off the premises as we speak." General Morrison's expression hardened. "Not if I have anything to say about it." He reached for his communications device, prepared to override security protocols personally. Outside, George was indeed being gently but firmly guided away from his observation point by the two security forces officers. He moved slowly, leaning on his cane, looking back occasionally at the ceremony he was being forced to leave. "It's for your own safety, sir," the first officer explained kindly. "With all the VIPs present, we have to maintain strict perimeter control." George nodded in resignation. "I understand. You're just doing your job." As they walked, George's thoughts drifted to another day, decades earlier, when he had stood on this very base watching the first test flight of an experimental aircraft incorporating his radar cross-section reduction principles. That day, he had been surrounded by generals and program directors, all eager to associate themselves with what they already recognized as a breakthrough. Today, he walked away as a stranger, unknown and unacknowledged. They had nearly reached the public viewing area when a commotion behind them caused the officers to turn. An Air Force staff car was approaching at speed, coming to a sharp halt nearby. From it emerged General Morrison's aide, looking slightly out of breath. "Officers, halt," he commanded. "By direct order of General Morrison, this gentleman is to be escorted to the VIP section immediately." The security officers looked confused. "Sir, we were instructed to—" "Those instructions are superseded," the aide interrupted, presenting his credentials. "General Morrison's orders take priority. Dr. Thompson is to be brought to the ceremony without delay." George looked startled at the use of his title and name. It had been many years since anyone had addressed him as Dr. Thompson in an official capacity. "There seems to be some confusion," George said modestly. "I'm just here to observe," the aide addressed him with newfound respect. "Dr. Thompson, General Morrison sends his personal apologies for this oversight. Your presence at this ceremony is not just welcomed, but essential. If you'll please come with me, sir." The security officers stepped back, clearly surprised by this turn of events. George hesitated, uncertain how to respond to this sudden reversal. "May I ask what prompted this change?" he inquired carefully. "Dr. Chen recognized your work, sir," the aide explained. "She brought it to General Morrison's attention immediately." George's expression softened at the mention of Dr. Chen, the materials scientist with the young boy. "Yes, she identified your equations from the technical literature. Said they were unmistakable." A smile slowly spread across George's face, not of vindication, but of genuine pleasure that his work had been recognized by someone who understood its significance. After decades of secrecy and anonymity, being acknowledged for his contributions meant more than any formal honor. "In that case," George said, straightening his posture and adjusting his flight jacket, "I'd be honored to accept the General's invitation." As the staff car returned to the ceremony area with George aboard, inside the event, the presentations were reaching their conclusion. The Air Force Chief of Staff had returned to the podium for final remarks before the aircraft's unveiling. "Throughout our history, American air power has relied on the brilliance of our engineers, the courage of our test pilots, and the dedication of countless men and women who have served in silence, their contributions often classified beyond public recognition," the chief was saying. "Today's achievement stands on the shoulders of those quiet heroes." Dr. Chen, watching from her seat, felt a surge of satisfaction as she spotted the staff car returning with George Thompson aboard. She nudged Dr. Patterson and pointed discreetly. "Looks like you were right," Patterson conceded, clearly impressed. "That's really him." "Sometimes myths turn out to be real people," Dr. Chen replied with a smile. "People who deserved better than being turned away at the gate." General Morrison had quietly left his seat and was now waiting at the security checkpoint as George's vehicle arrived. The crowd's attention remained focused on the Chief of Staff's speech, so few noticed the exchange taking place at the perimeter. The general personally opened the car door for George, extending his hand in greeting. "Dr. Thompson, I'm General David Morrison. I can't express how honored I am to meet you, sir." George accepted the handshake with dignity. "The honor is mine, General, though I must say this is more welcome than I expected today." "A grave oversight on our part," Morrison acknowledged, "one we intend to correct immediately." As George was escorted through the security checkpoint, this time with an honor guard that had materialized seemingly from nowhere, the young officer who had initially turned him away stood at attention, his face a mask of professional neutrality. Despite his evident shock, George paused briefly as he passed. "No hard feelings, son. You were doing your job." The officer swallowed hard. "Thank you, sir, and I apologize for the misunderstanding." General Morrison guided George toward the VIP section, walking slowly to accommodate the older man's pace. "Dr. Thompson, with your permission, we'd like to modify the program slightly to acknowledge your presence." George looked uncomfortable. "That's really not necessary, General. I came to see the aircraft, not to be seen myself." "With all due respect, sir, it is necessary," Morrison insisted gently. "Your work made this day possible. The men and women working on this program should know who laid the foundation they built upon." Before George could protest further, they reached the VIP section where Dr. Chen was waiting, her son Alex beside her. Her face lit up when she saw George approaching. "With the General, Dr. Thompson," she said warmly, extending her hand. "I'm so glad they found you." "You found me first," George replied with a twinkle in his eye, "and recognized my scribbles from what I hear. That's quite impressive, Dr. Chen." "Your equations aren't scribbles," she said firmly. "They're the foundation of everything we do. My entire doctoral thesis built on principles you established decades ago." Alex looked up at George with undisguised admiration. "Mom says you invented stealth aircraft?" George chuckled. "Not single-handedly, young man. It was a team effort over many years. I just helped solve some of the early puzzles." General Morrison escorted George to a specially prepared seat in the front row, directly facing the podium, and the still-closed hangar doors behind it. As George sat down, Morrison leaned in close. "We've made some adjustments to the unveiling, Dr. Thompson. I hope you don't mind being acknowledged for your contributions." Before George could respond, the Air Force Chief of Staff was concluding his remarks. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we reveal the B-21 Raider, I've been informed of a special guest joining us today, a man whose pioneering work in radar cross-section reduction mathematics formed the foundation of our stealth program. Please, join me in welcoming Dr. George Thompson, whose classified work in the 1960s and 70s made today's achievement possible." A spotlight suddenly illuminated George's seat, and the assembled crowd turned in surprise. After a moment of stunned silence, applause began, tentative at first, then building to a sustained ovation as word spread through the audience about who George was. The two executives who had mocked him earlier sat frozen in their seats, expressions of disbelief and embarrassment on their faces as they realized their error. Nearby, military officers stood in respect, applauding the man whose name they had seen in classified historical documents but had never expected to meet. George sat uncomfortably in the spotlight, nodding in modest acknowledgement of the applause, but clearly unaccustomed to such public recognition. Dr. Chen noticed his discomfort and leaned over. "They've waited decades to thank you," she said quietly. "Let them have this moment." George nodded, understanding. After decades in the shadows, stepping into the light, even briefly, required its own kind of courage. As the applause finally subsided, the Air Force Chief of Staff continued. Dr. Thompson's work remained classified for national security reasons, preventing public recognition of his achievements. Today we begin to correct that historical oversight. The chief gestured toward the massive hangar doors. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, the moment you've been waiting for. Please direct your attention to the arrival of the B-21 Raider." The distinctive sound came first, a whisper rather than a roar, the hallmark of advanced engineering that George knew intimately. Heads turned skyward as the B-21 appeared, seeming to materialize from nowhere, its sleek profile unlike anything the public had seen before. Even those who had worked on the program gasped at the sight of their creation in flight, performing, a perfect approach that demonstrated its revolutionary capabilities. As the aircraft taxied closer to the viewing area, something unusual became apparent. The crowd fell silent, confusion spreading across faces as they made out text painted on the fuselage of the otherwise unmarked aircraft. "George Thompson, Legend of the Skies." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Who was George Thompson? Why was his name on the nation's most advanced aircraft? The Air Force Chief of Staff approached the microphone, his face solemn. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we honor not just a machine, but the man whose pioneering work made it possible." In 1967, Major George Thompson developed the mathematical models for radar cross-section reduction that remain the foundation of stealth technology today. The crowd turned, looking for this unknown hero among them. His combat service and operations, still classified, saved countless American lives. His work on early stealth prototypes, during which he personally flew 23 high-risk test missions, established principles that have protected American pilots for generations. At the front row of the VIP section, George sat motionless, tears welling in his eyes as he stared at his name emblazoned on the aircraft's fuselage. Dr. Chen reached over and gently squeezed his hand in silent support. And yet, due to the classified nature of his contributions, George Thompson's name appears in no public record of aviation advancement. His medals remain in a drawer, his commendations sealed in files. Few have clearance to read. General Morrison stood beside the Chief of Staff now, adding his voice to the tribute. For those in the defense and aviation communities who have heard whispers of Thompson's equations or the Thompson principles without knowing their origin, today we put a face to that legacy. Dr. George Thompson sits among us today. All eyes turned to George as the spotlight once again found him in the crowd. The elderly man rose slowly to his feet, his bearing still military despite his years. Across the tarmac, members of the Air Force Honor Guard snapped to attention, in perfect unison, offering a formal salute to the man who had worked in shadows for so many decades. The crowd erupted in applause, rising to their feet in a spontaneous standing ovation. George acknowledged the recognition with a modest nod, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but deeply moved by the gesture. The two executives who had mocked him earlier sat frozen in their seats, expressions of disbelief and embarrassment on their faces as they realized their grave error. The young security officer who had turned George away stood at rigid attention at the perimeter, his face a mask of professional neutrality despite his evident shock. As the applause continued, the Air Force chief gestured for George to join him at the podium. General Morrison moved to George's side, offering his arm for support as the elderly engineer made his way slowly up the steps to the stage. The applause grew even louder as George reached the microphone. "I never expected this," George began, his voice steady despite his emotion. When you work on classified programs, you accept that public recognition isn't part of the deal. Your reward comes from solving the problem, protecting the warfighter, serving your country. He paused, looking out at the crowd, and then at the B-21 bearing his name. I was part of a team, a remarkable group of engineers, mathematicians, and pilots who pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Many of them are no longer with us. This honor belongs to them as much as to me, George continued, growing more confident as he spoke. The equations that form the foundation of stealth technology weren't created in isolation. They built upon the work of others before us, and they've been refined by brilliant minds in the decades since. That's how progress works. Standing on, the shoulders of those who came before, reaching higher than they could alone. He turned to look at the B-21, his name prominently displayed on its surface. This aircraft represents not just what we accomplished then, but what the next generation has achieved since. Dr. Chen and her colleagues have taken our early concepts and advanced them beyond anything we could have imagined in the 1960s. The true legacy isn't in my name on that fuselage, it's in the continuous chain of innovation that connects past to present to future. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, George found himself surrounded by young engineers and officers, all eager to connect with the living legend. Dr. Chen stayed close, partly to support him through what was clearly an overwhelming experience and partly because she had questions of her own. During a brief moment when they found themselves relatively alone, she voiced the one that had been foremost in her mind. "Dr. Thompson, may I ask why you came today?"
After all this time, what made you decide to attend this unveiling? George considered the question carefully. I'm 86 years old, Dr. Chen. I've outlived most of my colleagues from those early days. When I saw the announcement about the
B-21 in Aviation Week, something told me this might be my last chance to see how our work had evolved. He smiled gently. I didn't come seeking recognition. I just wanted to see the aircraft. I'm glad you did, she replied sincerely. Without your presence today, a crucial piece of aviation history might have remained hidden. And selfishly, I'm grateful for the chance to meet the man whose equations I've been applying throughout my career. As they spoke, Alex returned from exploring the reception area, his eyes wide with excitement. Dr. Thompson, the boy said as George sat down, will you tell me how you made planes invisible? George chuckled warmly. Not invisible, young man, just a bit harder to see, and it's a very long story involving a lot of math. I like math, Alex replied earnestly. Mum says it's the language the universe speaks. Your mother is a wise woman, George said with an approving nod toward Dr. Chen, and she's right. The universe does speak in mathematics if you know how to listen. As the reception continued, George found himself the center of attention, approached by engineers, young and old, each eager to connect with the man whose equations they had studied in classified briefings. Among them were the two men who had mocked him earlier. They approached hesitantly, embarrassment evident in their bearing. Dr. Thompson, the first one began awkwardly. We owe you an apology for our comments earlier. We had no idea who you were. George regarded them calmly. No apology necessary, gentlemen. You couldn't have known. His words were gracious, but there was a glint in his eye that suggested he hadn't forgotten their dismissive attitude. The second man pressed on. We're both with Northrop Grumman's Advanced Development Division. If you'd be willing, we'd love to hear about your experiences firsthand. Perhaps over dinner sometime? I appreciate the invitation, George replied diplomatically, though I suspect much of what I could tell you would still be classified. He nodded politely and moved away, guided by Dr. Chen, who had observed the exchange with silent satisfaction. You handled that graciously, she commented as they walked toward the refreshment area. "When you've lived as long as I have," George responded with a wry smile, "you learn that seeing people reckon with their misjudgments is satisfaction enough. No need to twist the knife." 6 months later, George returned to Edwards Air Force Base, this time through the front gate with a
VIP escort.
The base commander personally welcomed him to give a presentation to young pilots and engineers eager to learn from living history. His previously classified memoirs were being published, carefully reviewed by security officials, but largely intact. His story was finally cleared to be told. Dr. Chen and Alex had become regular visitors to George's home, where the boy was receiving informal but invaluable tutoring in mathematics and aviation principles. Today they walked alongside him as he toured the facility, George pointing out aspects of the B-21 that only someone who truly understood its origins could know. "The most interesting innovations aren't always visible," George explained to Alex as they walked the perimeter of the display aircraft. "See how the engine intakes are shaped? That's to minimize radar returns from the compressor blades, one of the most reflective components of any jet." Alex absorbed every word, his natural curiosity fueled by George's patient explanations. Dr. Chen watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction, witnessing the transfer of knowledge across generations, precisely the kind of mentorship that had shaped her own career. The tour concluded at a newly installed memorial wall where names of test pilots lost during classified stealth development were finally being acknowledged publicly. The wall stood in a quiet garden area away from the main facilities, a place for reflection and remembrance. George moved slowly along the wall, touching names and whispering to each. "They know now, Mike," Dr. Chen heard him say to the final name. "They finally know what we did." Mike Winters had been George's closest friend on the original team, a gifted test pilot with an engineer's mind. He had died during the 7th test flight of an early prototype, his aircraft disappearing from radar over the Nevada desert, exactly as designed, but tragically not as intended. His remains weren't recovered for 3 days, and his family had been told only that he died in a classified training accident. Now his name was inscribed on the wall along with his true designation. Major Michael Winters, Midnight Ghost Program, pioneer of stealth aviation. "They were heroes, weren't they?" Alex said, reading the names with solemn respect. "Even though nobody knew?" "The truest kind of heroes," George confirmed. "They served knowing they might never receive recognition, that their contributions might remain hidden for generations." "Like you did," Alex observed innocently. George smiled gently at the boy. "I was fortunate enough to live long enough to see the recognition come. Many weren't so lucky." As they prepared to leave, George took one last look at the B-21 on display, his name no longer painted on its fuselage, but now permanently associated with the technology in history books, technical manuals, and educational programs. More importantly, the names of his colleagues, both those who had lived to see this day and those who hadn't, were finally receiving their due recognition. The classified curtain had been partly lifted, allowing the world to acknowledge the pioneers, who had revolutionized aviation from the shadows. For George Thompson, that acknowledgement meant more than any personal honor. It validated not just his work, but the sacrifices made by everyone who had contributed to a program that changed the course of aviation history. Some contributions remain unseen, but that doesn't make them any less essential. And sometimes, if you live long enough, the recognition finally comes, not just for yourself, but for all those who walked the path with you. The man they had dismissed as just another old veteran trying to relive glory days had, in fact, built the future they were celebrating. And now, at last, everyone knew. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.